Hi everyone, it's Chris Hicks, Head of Press and Communications at UKIP. I'm joined once again with UKIP member Carl Benjamin. So I think the next thing we need to talk about is the political activist Tommy Robinson being banned from Facebook. This has happened in the wake of the premiere of his documentary Panodrama, which covers an undercover documentary on Panorama while they were attempting to get a documentary on Tommy Robinson himself. And in that documentary, it alleges links between the BBC, the political reporter John Sweeney, and the far-left campaigning organisation Hope Not Hate. So what do you think about that one?
Well, I think that it's entirely likely that the BBC has been working with Hope Not Hate. I mean, John Sweeney seemed to admit it in Tommy's documentary, which is on his YouTube channel, so anyone can watch it. It's had something like 500,000 views so far, so a lot of people have. And I think that this is going directly against the BBC's foundational charter, that they'll remain impartial, because there is absolutely no way that you can do a documentary of any kind on Tommy Robinson, a political activist. So, he's not impartial in any way. He's got an agenda. He's, like all of us. I'm a political activist. I've got an agenda. So anyone who is a political activist who has an agenda should not be working in such close concert with the BBC, because they have a commitment to impartiality, and that is just not possible when working with a group like Hope Not Hate. I mean, one of the researchers recently was revealed to be a member of Britain's Communist Party, which incidentally doesn't field any candidates. They just tell all of their party members to vote Labour. Which should tell you everything you need to know. But yeah, they're an incredibly radical organisation, but they're also an incredibly mucky organisation, and they're not afraid to do the dirty work and get involved with subterfuge and sabotaging rival political activist groups as and when they can. And I don't know how they're funded, but they seem to do this professionally, and they don't seem to have much in the way of actually public traction. I mean, for example, I've got quite a large YouTube channel, and I have people who support what I do, and so they donate, and that's how I'm funded, and everyone can see it. I am aware that a percentage of their funding comes from George Soros's Open Society Foundation, and I imagine there are various other NGOs and rich activists who are interested in promoting their cause as well. So coming on to the actual deplatforming of Tommy, the timing is incredible. It was just days after Tommy released his Panodrama documentary at the BBC studios at Manchester.
What a coincidence, eh?
Well, what a coincidence, where 4,000 to 5,000 people turned up to watch it live, and it did in fact have quite a lot of stuff in it that was it painted the BBC's Panorama in a very bad light, and from their own words and from their own actions on video. So, and a lot of it was just uncut, long clips that you can't really argue very convincingly, I would say, have been taken out of context. And I haven't seen the BBC actually claim that either. In fact, they have already issued an apology for John Sweeney's comments and behaviour, the homophobic and various other comments that he made, and his behaviour in that documentary. So they've copped to it, as far as I'm concerned. But the reasons given for his deplatforming, I think, are very suspect. So just to go over them quickly, he was accused of inciting hatred and violence against Muslims, saying, according to the BBC, he's encouraged his followers to behead people who follow the Quran, which is an ironic turnaround of what some jihadis are saying about people who don't follow the Quran. I've seen absolutely no evidence of this, absolutely none. I find it very difficult to believe that a professional activist like Tommy Robinson, given the political situation he's been in for the last, 5 or 6 years at this point, and given the hypersensitivity to everything he does in the British political class, would be stupid enough to say anything of the sort. He knows what the consequence of that would be. And I follow him on these social media platforms, and I've never seen him say anything of the sort, right? So no evidence has been provided to corroborate any of those allegations by the BBC, so I don't believe them, because I just don't think that's true. I think that's been made up. But secondly, a clip that's from a video that is 2 years old, when Tommy was working at the Rebel Media, has been taken out of context and used against him as if he was suggesting that all Muslims are jihadis. Because in the clip, he's very specifically outside, I can't remember which mosque it was, but it was a mosque that was confirmed to have a hate preacher in it, who was preaching jihad and hatred for the infidel and all that. And And he was saying how the area had produced dozens of jihadis, something like 16 jihadis had travelled to Syria from the particular location that he was in. And so he was speaking very specifically about the radicalised Muslims who were in that area. And you can see that he's specifically speaking to that because he was giving statistics like 66% of Muslims in Britain wouldn't report to the authorities if someone they knew joined ISIS. And there were something like 100,000 people in the country, Muslims in the country, who were supportive of suicide bombing and things like this. I mean, that's obviously not popular mainstream Muslim opinion. He's obviously talking about the radicals. So for them to take one section, leave that information out, and then try to paint it like he was saying that every Muslim does this is obviously demonstrably dishonest and makes this look like nothing other than a political smear. Because in these comments that he was supposed to have made, he was supposed to have made them like 6 months ago or something. If that had been the case, it would have been everywhere. The second Tommy Robinson posted to Facebook or Instagram, "Kill all Muslims," that would have been, yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is you were on LBC earlier this week. We had a debate about Mr. Tommy Robinson's banning from Facebook on the Nick Ferrari breakfast show. The other person in that conversation was a gentleman called Mohammed Shafiq, who's the head of the Ramadan Foundation. He's a former member of the Liberal Democrats. Indeed, he was a member of the Liberal Democrats and met with a gentleman called Nick Clegg, who's, of course, the former leader of the Liberal Democrats, former deputy... Sir Nick Clegg, indeed, former deputy prime minister, and of course now the head of Facebook's global communications since last year. So it's an incredible coincidence on this front. But Mr. Shafiq brought up this particular example that you're talking about in that regard. It really is fascinating, though, as you say, the timing of all of this. They seem to claim that there's this. They've warned him multiple times, and this is now kind of the last straw, so to speak. But for Mr. Shafiq to have this meeting and to be so heavily tied into the political establishment of this country, it really begs the question: was this totally politically motivated? Well,
I think there's enough evidence so far to suggest that it's only politically motivated. Otherwise, why now? Why now? Why not yesterday? Why not 5 weeks ago? Why not the day that these things alleged to have happened? The thing I found very surprising when I was having the debate with him on LBC is just how angry and confrontational he became when I asked him what's the evidence. He couldn't provide any. All he could say is reassert the buzzwords that he'd previously said. Nothing solid, and he just became very confrontational and defensive.
There was also something in that interview, and we'll link that below this video, where Nick Ferrari said, well, if Harold Shipman lived on one street, I suppose that, that doesn't mean that all the doctors who live on that street are all mass murderers. But I would have thought, well, if there were actually 10 Harold Shipmans within a street, I would actually be asking the question, well, what's going on here?
Yes.
So it was a bit of a false equivalence from him.
Absolutely, especially if it could be tied to a medical establishment that was preaching the Harold Shipman ideology that had to be dealt with by the authorities. You've got to be able to put two and two together sometimes.
There's also a UKIP aspect to this, because we actually had a number of notable UKIPers, including individuals like Rhys Coombs, the chairman for Young Independents in the Southwest, and a number of others who were actually banned. They were locked out of their Facebook accounts on the very same day that Tommy Robinson was banned. The party, we made a big fuss out of this. We put out a lot of statements, and then magically, it seems, the next day their accounts were returned to them.
Well, you have to understand the nature of glitches that happen on Facebook. Now, glitches never happen to left-wing activists. They only ever happen to right-wing or centrist activists, and only ever to people who are hostile to the current political establishment. It's a very strange thing, but they do get magically fixed when enough ruckus has been caused on social media. Now, I'm just observing the trends. I don't know why this is the case. It just is.
What kind of impact do you think this will have on Tommy Robinson's abilities to market his ideas? Do you think it's going to be effective?
The fact of it is, deplatforming does work. There's no getting around the fact that simply censoring someone prevents them from speaking with their audience. And that's why they do it. If it wasn't effective, they wouldn't bother. the difficulty for Tommy now is that he's only got one major social media platform left, which is YouTube, which has already been demonetized because obviously he's been on their radar as well. So Tommy is going to have to be very careful with the things he says, because one of the things I think that they were able to clip the out of context part of the video is because he gets a bit emotional and heated when he's going into his spiel, and he spoke clumsily, so if you take something out of context, you can make it sound like he's saying something that he's not. And so he's gonna have to sort of do a Jordan Peterson and start being very specific and careful with the things that he's saying, because he knows the establishment is gunning for him. He wrote a book called Enemy of the State because he is in effect the enemy of the British establishment at this point. They don't want to have the conversation that he has been insisting is raised, and he hasn't been wrong on any of the things that he said. Prison radicalization, grooming gangs, just other social issues among these communities. He's not wrong on any of it, and everyone knows he's not wrong, and nobody wants to admit it. But at the end of the day, the political establishment really need to think about somehow rehabilitating Tommy Robinson, because he is not just saying Muslims are evil. He's not saying that. He knows Muslims. He grew up in Luton, and he has Muslim friends. He has, close confidence. The problem is the radicalization and frankly the Islamists. And I guess this will bring us on to the next story with Claire Dooley that we can talk about in a moment.
Well, before we just get into that, I think
Sorry, Stacey Dooley.
I think another interesting aspect about this all is kind of the left's response to this, which is really quite disturbing, to all of this deplatforming. I remember when the political left, they were kind of anti-corporate, they kind of questioned private...
That's where I came from.
Exactly, and now they're all coming out and saying, well, they're a private company, they can do what they want. Well, wait a minute, guys, suddenly you seem to have switched. When somebody is saying something you don't agree with, you're happy for them to be banned, but now it's open season, isn't it?
So suddenly they break out their Milton Friedman, don't they? And they say, well, actually, Mises said, exactly, it's amazing how they abandon their own principles when it's politically convenient. But you'll notice how it's only when it's politically convenient. As soon as it's their enemies being silenced, they're all for it. Bravo, he was spewing hatred. That's a brilliant thing. As soon as it's a left-wing activist who, it depends which kind of left-wing activist, in fact. But when it's one of their own, this is the worst thing that can happen. What happened to free speech? As soon as it's someone else, well, it was a good thing. There is absolutely, and it's just an argument for power. It is honestly only, does this advantage us or does this disadvantage us? And they can find a rationale for either way to support whichever way the wind needs to blow. They do not stand on a consistent principle on this.
So we're UKIP, we're the party of free speech, free expression. What's the solution to this? A digital Bill of Rights?
Yeah, I actually think so. And one of the things that legal scholars often have to wrangle with is the question of securing your rights. Now, it's all and good saying, well, I have the right to a fair trial, I have the right to free speech. But if you can't actually secure those rights, then you don't really have those rights. And that's why we provide a lawyer to a defendant from the state if they can't afford one of their own. Obviously, I'm sure they're not going to be the world's greatest lawyers, but you will at least have, a legal expert who will give you representation. And I think that this same principle needs to be extended to things like free speech and, in particular, social media. Because if the dialogue is taking part on the internet, then you are going to need some way of engaging with that to be able to exercise and secure your right to free speech. And if the platforms have unlimited license to simply trample on that right, then I think it is at that point the onus on the government to secure the rights to free speech of the people and the populace by saying, right, we will need some kind of digital Bill of Rights. In the same way that if everyone went in, there are privately owned public spaces already, and in America in particular, where these things are in existence, and there are rules for them already, and you can't just say ban people from entering into these spaces, even though they're privately owned. So it's not that this sort of stuff is outside of the legal framework we already have. We're just not thinking about it. Because frankly, social media is just too new. In 100 years' time, this sort of stuff will all be in the history books. When they take down a Facebook page that has more than 1 million followers, that's huge. Yeah. And I think that we need to think about how people are securing their rights to free speech if the speech is done on a particular medium. And these are open to the public. Anyone can sign up and open accounts. So I think that there should be more of a responsibility on those platforms, and they should think of themselves as platforms and not publishers and curators. Because at the end of the day, that's not their job. They're not equipped for it. They're far too biased in one direction, and everyone knows it.
And of course, this is something that's deeply affected you, because you've had what is effectively a lifetime ban from Twitter, I understand.
Absolutely. And I've had no reason for it either.
Yes, quite. Well, the head of Twitter, I understand, spoke to Joe Rogan in a podcast, and Joe Rogan asked, well, why was Sargon of Akkad banned from Twitter? And he said he just didn't know.
And I didn't know. I was never given a reason. So, I mean, luckily for me, I always held Twitter in contempt, because Twitter's not a very good platform. It's kind of like, it's like heroin. You know, people are addicted to it, and it's doing serious damage to the journalistic class. The other day, the Daily Beast, an online leftist publication, actually had a set of guidelines leaked where they were trying to encourage their journalists to just get off of Twitter, because, it's an entirely another subject to go on to, but it's causing serious damage to the journalistic class and the political class. Twitter becomes not an echo chamber, but a pressure chamber, where it seems that the public perception of a thing is much greater than it really is, because Twitter's actually quite small for a social media platform and for a tech giant, and it's not real life. What happens on Twitter, most of what happens on Twitter is childishness anyway. So we definitely need a digital bill of rights.